So, good evening, everybody. And this evening, I want to give you a short video lecture on Yeats's essay, um, The Celtic Element in Literature, which I've asked you to read for this week. So, what I'm going to do in this presentation is point to some key ideas in the essay. And tomorrow, I would like you to contact me via Google Hangouts so that we can discuss how these ideas relate to the poems that I asked you to read for today. That is The Lake Isle of Innisfree and The Man Who Dreamed of Fairyland. The first thing to draw your attention to are the two figures whom Yeats refers to whom Yeats refers at the beginning of this essay. And these are the French writer Ernest Renan and the English writer Matthew Arnold. Both of these are writers from the 19th century. And he refers to a work by Ernest Renan called The Poetry of the Celtic Races in English. This work was originally published in 1859 in French as La Poésie des races celtiques. And this work had a significant influence on one of the most important English intellectual figures of the Victorian era in the middle of the 19th century, Matthew Arnold. And it was part of the motivation for Arnold writing a hugely influential work called The Study of Celtic Literature, and that was published in 1867. In essence, what both Renan and Arnold argued was that the Celtic peoples had a distinctive temperament. And this temperament was distinguished by a very strong sensitivity and a very high imaginative capacity, a very highly developed sense of imagination that would give rise to art, literature, poetry, music, and so on. This idea gained much ground in the latter part of the 19th century. And the question then is, to what extent was Yeats himself, in his so-called Celtic Twilight poetry presenting the rural Irish landscape and people as a place of magic, spirituality, imagination, to what extent could that be said to have come from these ideas about the Celtic nature, the Celtic races, the Celtic peoples that had first been put forward in the 19th century by Renan and Matthew Arnold? Now, you will be reading from different sources, reading this essay from different sources. I am taking the essay from a work called Essays and Introductions. This had been published by Macmillan, I think it was first of all in 1955, collection, rather 1961, was a very famous collection of Yeats's writings. So I'm going to take the page numbers from there, but you can trace back the quotations to the source you are using. So the first passage that I wanted to read out for you is from page 176 in this book, Essays and Introductions. Matthew Arnold wrote, "It was not easy when Matthew Arnold wrote, it was not easy to know as much as we know now of folk song and folk belief. And I do not think he understood that our natural magic is but the ancient religion of the world, the ancient worship of nature and that troubled ecstasy before her, that certainty of all beautiful places being haunted, which it brought into men's minds. So what he is basically saying here is that Matthew Arnold's ideas about the Celt, and for Yeats he's thinking in particular about the Irish, the ancient Irish, really was not unique to the Celt. Rather, the attributes that Arnold identified with the Celtic peoples, not just the Irish, it should have to be said, but also the Highland Scots, the Welsh, the Breton. Yeats argues was at one point universal, a universal religion in which nature was worshipped, the ancient worship of nature. This was universal. This was not exclusive to any particular tribe or any particular people. So, in a way, what Yeats is attempting to do is to make a claim that what he is identifying in the Irish tradition, particularly folklore beliefs in magic and so on, was part of an ancient worldwide religious disposition among human beings in ancient times, and it wasn't exclusive to any particular race. So that's an important point for us to consider. Why is it important? Because it raises the question as to whether Yeats is identifying something exclusively Irish in his poems about Ireland, or whether his representations of Irish folklore, myth, magic, and so on speaks more universally to wider society. One of the things that I would also like to draw your attention to here, and it occurs in this edition on page 177 to 178, is a distinction that Matthew Arnold draws on the study of Celtic literature, and it is a distinction that Yeats takes up. And this is a distinction that Arnold draws between what he calls the Greek mode, the Greek temperament, and the Celtic temperament. Arnold, in that work, claimed that the classical Greek temperament was fundamentally based upon balance, order, reason. In a word, he says, science. The scientific spirit was what emerged from the ancient Greek world. And he sets this in contrast to emotion, passion, indeed you might say the irrational in the Celtic temperament, in the Celtic spirit. Yeats argues that if one looks at poetry coming particularly from Roman times, or indeed some of the great works of English literature, we see this Greek attitude to nature. And he gives certain examples. He quotes from the English Romantic poet John Keats. He also quotes from William Shakespeare, and he quotes from Virgil. And the quotations are given to indicate to us that nature, as represented in these poems, is nature not as the Celt would have seen it, but rather nature almost as a handmaiden to human interests. Nature is something that's placid. He says in these particular instances that the writers looked at nature in the modern way, that is, in the way of Yeats' own time, the way of people who may be poetical but are more interested in one another than in nature, which has faded to be but friendly and pleasant. In other words, It's no longer wild nature, it's domesticated nature, the way of people who have forgotten the ancient religion. So this is what Yeats says of the modern time, particularly, I guess he's thinking of industrialized Europe in his own time, that this ancient religion of nature has been forgotten. By contrast, he describes at the beginning of part 3 of the essay a very different attitude to nature in ancient times that would continue to be discovered in the Ireland of his own time. Men who lived in a world where anything might flow and change and become any other thing, and among great gods whose passions were in the flaming sunset, and in the thunder and the thunder shower, had not our thoughts of weight and measure. And I would ask you to think about those lines in relation to Ferguson the Druid, where we see everything in a state of continual change. And what he says there, what Yeats is saying to the reader there, is that that type of world, that type of existence, is completely incompatible with a modern, scientific, rational way of approaching nature and life, in which everything is weighed and measured and calculated. This idea of calculation and that would have been completely unknown and irrelevant to the followers of this ancient religion of nature. And where he sees this, the continuity or the remnant at least of this ancient religion of nature, is in folk literature. And he talks about this in part 3 on the paragraph beginning, all folk literature. He says, all folk literature and all literature that keeps the folk tradition delights in unbounded and immortal things. So this is very important in the Irish context, where you are seeing Yeats as part of a folk revival, the revival of folk culture, the revival of language, customs and traditions and beliefs of the Irish people, beliefs dating back hundreds, if not even thousands of years. And what he's claiming for that is there is a delight in all that is liberated, unbounded, and immortal. And this is what we see even in the plays on Cuchulainn. He is presented to us as an immortal figure. What's also important to note in the essay, however, is that he takes many of his examples from beyond Ireland. He looks to the Caelvala, for example. He even looks to the Mohammedan king in the Song of Roland. And within that he sets Cuchulainn, and he sets the Irish characters, Oisin. So this is important in arguing that the rediscovery of ancient Irish mythology, folklore and so on is part of a more broad appreciation of the presence of this ancient religion throughout a wide variety of literary sources, and that's something we're going to see through the course of the essay. He also mentions on page 180 a work called Love Songs of Connacht. Now, Connacht is the province in the west of Ireland, and Connacht became idealised by those who sought to revive folk culture in Ireland at the end of the 19th century. Love Songs of Connacht was written by a man compiled by a man called Douglas Hyde. I'll give you his name. I don't know if you can see that there, Douglas Hyde. Douglas Hyde was responsible for the revival of the Irish language. He himself was from the west of Ireland. He had been educated at Trinity College in Dublin. And what Yeats draws our attention to in the translations that Hyde provides of original Irish language poems and songs in Love Songs of Connacht is the passion. The sentiment is not one of reason, it's rather of passion, of deep and profound emotion. And this ties back to this notion of the worship of nature and passion. Linked into this is the idea of profound melancholy, linked to this notion of deep passion among peoples of the ancient world in their encounters with nature, is the idea of profound melancholy. And where we encounter this profound melancholy in great works of literature is for Yeats where we see the spirit that Arnold had identified with the Celt most profoundly. So again, Yeats mentions Irish figures taken from Irish mythology, but he places them alongside figures taken from a wide variety of European literary traditions. This is what he writes on page 182. Men did not mourn merely because their beloved was married to another, or because learning was bitter in the mouth. For such mourning believes that life might be happy were it different, and is therefore the less mourning, but because they had been born and must die with their great thirst unslaked. And so it is that all the august, sorrowful persons of literature, the august, the great, grand, great, sorrowful persons of literature, Cassandra and Helen, Helen of Troy, and Deirdre, one of the female figures from Irish mythology, and Lear, King Lear from Shakespeare's great play, and Tristan, Tristan the figure from Richard Wagner's great opera Tristan and Isolde. These have come out of legends and are indeed but the images of the primitive imagination mirrored in the little looking glass of the modern and classical imagination. So what he's saying is in these great works of literature we are getting a taste of what was even more profound, more substantial emotionally in ancient times. The primitive imagination is mirrored in these great works such as King Lear, the story of Helen of Troy, or the legend of Deirdre. This is that melancholy a man knows when he is face to face with nature and thinks he hears her communing with him about the mournfulness of being born and of dying. And how can it do otherwise than call into his mind its exiles, its flights across the seas, that it may stir the ever-smouldering ashes? Now, one of the things that he raises for consideration that most interests me about this essay is the whole idea of excess, which he talks about in the fourth section of the Celtic Element in literature. The part beginning, Matthew Arnold asks how much of the Celt must one imagine in an ideal man of genius. You see that sentence, that's the section I'm talking about. He quotes a painter in this section called Samuel Palmer. Now, Samuel Palmer was a devotee of one of the most extravagantly mystical poets of English Romanticism, namely William Blake. And this is on page 184. He says, certainly, as Samuel Palmer wrote, excess is the vivifying spirit of the finest art, and we must always seek to make excess more abundantly excessive. Now, why is this significant? Well, I think it's significant because one of the things that Yeats is doing here is countering the value that Matthew Arnold in England laid upon balance, measure, order in his writings on the study of Celtic literature. And by contrast to this, Yeats is saying no. He's saying what is most powerful, particularly for the artist or the writer, is excess, not balance, reason, or order. We must always seek to make excess more abundantly excessive. There is in that a Wordsworthian idea of overflow of spontaneous feeling and powerful emotion. This was an idea that William Wordsworth attributed to the romantic temperament, the overflow of spontaneous passion, feeling, imagination. But I think there's also a very interesting point about the term excess in this instance, because the concept of excess, or the idea of excess in the 1890s, would undoubtedly have decadent undercurrents or associations, particularly for, I would say, educated English audiences. Excess would have been strongly associated with Parisian, bohemian artistic circles, and one of the figures with whom that circle or that environment milieu would have been most strongly identified was Oscar Wilde, who was seen in certain respects as a figure of excess. So something I'd ask you to think about is where Yeats's work lies on this question around excess. Is he thinking of excess in an exclusively aesthetic, artistic way, or does it have implications for the notion of the didactic, the moral aspect of literary works? Because it would seem to be very difficult to reconcile any notion of poetry or drama having a moral purpose with poetry and drama being given spontaneously to excess, or emotion to excess experience. The other thing I'd want to draw your attention to is what he says about the Celt and Celtic literature in this context. So he sets up a very interesting relation between Celtic literature and European literature. He says, I will put this differently and say that literature dwindles to a mere chronicle of circumstance, a mere description of circumstance, or passionless fantasies and passionless meditations, unless it is constantly flooded with the passions and beliefs of ancient times, and all of the fountains of the passions and beliefs of ancient times in Europe, the Slavonic, the Finnish, the Scandinavian, and the Celtic. Of all of these, the Celtic alone has been for centuries close to the main river of European literature. So he is in essence arguing that what he is doing in poetry and drama in his Irish medium is part of a great European tradition, but actually in some way it's the greatest part. So there's an interesting relation going on here between the Irish tradition belonging to the European, but in some ways being more distinctive because it has maintained more powerfully than other traditions this connection with the ancient religion that he describes at the beginning of this essay. Important figures that he references towards the end of this essay are Richard Wagner, who's this very dominant influence in Europe in the second half of the 19th century, through his great operas, which exerted an enormous influence, not just in the field of music, of course, but right through the arts, particularly in drama and indeed even in poetry. William Morris. Morris was someone interested in reviving English medieval folk traditions. He turned back to Chaucer, and he sought to create arts and crafts industries that would revive older ways of living, really, in the 1880s and in the 1890s. And Yeats and Morris had a close association during the 1880s. And Heinrich Ibsen. Heinrich Ibsen was Norwegian born, began his career as a dramatist in Bergen before going on to be widely celebrated across Europe, particularly in Copenhagen, and later his work was taken to Paris, where there was even a theatre dedicated to his work. Now, Ibsen is known as a social critic, but what Yeats is interested in Ibsen is the earlier work, most famously his play Peer Gynt, which is in touch with this ancient Scandinavian mythical traditions. So I'd like you to think about these various ideas when you look at the poems, and then we will have some online discussion. If any of you want to get in touch with me tomorrow, we can have a question-answer session for that. So thanks for your attention.